think we'll start the questions or dialogue right away. I would be asking you questions which link the book to the current situation, because curator Nanjo Fumio and Fumihiko Maki-san was here, and they provided pretty good background of the movement, how it was happened, and to the history and the first-hand observation. So I would go first with the book and how it linked to the present situations. And if we have time, I'm going to ask you a couple of questions of your work. And shall we start? Okay. Oops. 68. 10 years after Kikotake built his sky house. And of course, I show this to you because you're a generation of 68. Oops. And you actually were fascinated, as I know, by all these avant-garde movement, Constant on the left, and Super Studio, for instance, Archigram. There you are. Right. And I just wondered, why metabolism? And why today?
Well, I think that there are several explanations. One of them is a persistent fascination for Asia, partly based on the fact that I was a child here, partly based on a lot of presence in Asia, and I'm kind of surprised that some of the ambitions and some of the confidence that Metabolism had shown, the confidence that kind of basically you could have a absolutely contemporary architecture without almost any reference to any Western model. That confidence seems to have so completely disappeared. That was an important kind of reason to do it. And maybe the final one was to kind of really make a serious effort to see what architecture has gained in the time since the 60s and what architecture has lost. And of course, I've been talking about some of those losses. I have basically kind of suggested that the disconnection between the state and the architect maybe creates some freedoms, but I think it also has taken away a lot of possible dimensions, and perhaps the strongest dimension is to speculate not only in your own name, which is kind of what we are doing now, but in the name of a larger whole, and therefore, and I feel it personally very painfully sometimes. Yeah, I'd love to pretend, or I'd love to actually not pretend, but actually to believe that I'm kind of helping to make a better world, as they probably all did. And all I can claim at this moment is that I make small sections of the world better. But that is not the same thing.
Well, you actually already started something that which leads probably to my second question. I actually have keywords for my question. This one is called title. In the history, movement tends to associate itself with locale, place, locale. And the title of the book, Project Japan, seems to suggest something beyond, for me, just a very innocent about a country. For me, it suggests something, the involvement with the states and with the gentleman Atsusushi involved, for instance, that it seems to be saying that architecture cannot be achieved without certain political power. And for something, for somebody like you, who's actually a little bit on the left, I'm a little bit astonished and surprised. So is my interpretation too literal about this political power involvement with architecture? And what's your perspective on the state power and architecture?
Well, I think that maybe I should talk. The first time I really was tempted to become an architect, and in a way, the first time that I really looked at architecture as something that I could relate to in terms of my own temperament and interest, was when I saw the architecture that was designed and conceived by the Russians in the kind of beginning of the century, constructivism. I'm not sure, how familiar you are with it, kind of here and now, but that was kind of really an explosion, the first explosion of a kind of language of modern architecture. But very importantly, it was not only the language that has changed, which was mostly the case in Western Europe, but it was also the contents that had changed. I mean, it was the first time that I saw that architecture could be close to a kind of form of script writing. There were apartments that specifically abandoned the family, that specifically allowed a number of people to live in a group. Men and women would have an equal cell, but there would be no hierarchy kind of implied, etc., etc. So that whole discourse, and it therefore was already a kind of moment that you were at the same time seduced by an architectural language or an architectural phenomena, while you realized that it was closely associated with the state, and a state that basically at that point was already considered as a kind of totally evil kind of regime, the 60s in Soviet Union. And so, of course, you cannot be a child of the 20th century and not be skeptical about the state and not know what hideous crimes the state have engineered and not know how insane and horrid states have behaved. But at the same time, I think it is also impossible to be innocent and to say that architecture can, without the state or without, maybe it doesn't have to be the state, but without a city or at least without the support of a political domain, is kind of relatively helpless and in a way condemned to do innocent things.
Okay, I'm going to move on to the third keyword, which is movement, and that's the title of your introduction to the book. And you once said that Metabolism was maybe the first non-Western avant-garde movement, and you said that again earlier this evening. And you also wrote in the introduction of the book that Metabolism is the last movement that changed architecture. I want to show you this. This is 78, 20 years after Sky House, 10 years after you wrote Delirious New York, 10 years after Charles Jenks published his book of postmodern architecture, finally coming out in book form in 78. On the left is God of wind, God of change. That's Izosaki, who's always changing. On the right is God of thunder. Look at what he's holding. He is the one who, again, pounding the earth. And if you look very carefully on this cloud, which is always changing, Rem, this is your friend here. Ito-san, who's right there, of course. But they're all appearing from the horizon. I love this very much. This book is called, or special issues on, of Shinkenjuku, JA. It's called Metabolism. It suggests something, a family, and just like you suggested, loose enough and yet always changing in the landscape, keep moving, keep pushing forward, keep looking forward. And this is Zhang's chart of 2000. And what's astonishing to me, if you look very carefully, all the movement pretty much die there. There's only one ism here. Unfortunately, it's called corporate modernism. And if you look at the name, it's very interesting. Corporate office, no longer Koolhaas, no longer Eisenman, for instance, so on and so forth. So pretty much something happened between here and here. And now it's my question. I have long questions. Is movement in architecture possible today?
And
movement sometimes is a synonym for manifesto. Is manifesto possible today? Does movement and manifesto remain something what we call modern movement that has already gone, destroyed, sometimes in the 80s? I want to stop there. I have to.
Let's say I hate to be enlisted in the cause of pessimism. So systematically, I would say no. Of course, it's still possible. And in fact, you could say that the book Project Japan, even though it is a kind of rereading or reinterpretation of metabolism, it's also, of course, a manifesto in itself that, on the one hand, says that metabolists have to be reread, but it is also looking at aspects of the metabolists that have not been vented before or not been appreciated before. So I think that, of course, it's nonsense that you cannot continue to write manifestos. Although they will be always in a different language, a different format, and since the digital world is born, of course, the kind of sheer theatricality of a manifesto is probably also becoming kind of less feasible, and maybe we're looking at kind of more viral and distributed kind of sources of influence. But in terms of your question, what happened, I think it's very clear what happened. In 80, both Reagan and Thatcher came into power, and that became the launch of kind of neoliberalism. And I think that that is almost 50% of the explanation of what happened. We abandoned ideologies. We abandoned the state as an author. We deregulated, and of course, architecture is a very important part of regulation, or planning at least is a very important part of regulation. And so basically, we did a lot of things. And we dismantled the state and put some other system in place. And that system has a kind of vast effect on architects, because it not only isolates, as vis-à-vis each other, but it also forces us to express ourselves on a kind of much more personal way, and typically with perhaps less profound values or less profound ambitions, less shared ambitions.
Less shared. You brought up internet and spreading something around viral, and I'm going to continue that, talking about a little bit about social media. Since a movement is a collective awareness of something that somehow mobilize a movement in the society, do you think this would somehow bring to architecture the impact of internet, social media, and if not, if it only happens politically, as in, say, Arab Spring or Jasmine Revolution, it's not happening in architecture. It seems to me that we've been sidelined. What went wrong with architecture? Why you mentioned the press, which will be my next, actually my next keyword with media. You talk about the press is now cynical, and we all know the words starchitect, which maybe you're a part of that, as they call you. And yet, this is you. 3 years ago, in Venice Biennale, you questioned the relationship between architects and general public by examining what happened between architecture and media. And this, of course, we know this is the last time an architect puts on a cover for a magazine like Time. So, what happened?
The more you go on in this direction, the more I feel kind of revolt. I simply do not want to agree with you. I want to kind of really insist that there is every reason to be super optimistic, that I do not feel a victim of any kind of situation, that I think we are dealing with a situation which is complex, but probably situation has always been complex, also in the 60s and the 70s, and that we have to kind of perhaps mobilize different sides of our brain or different kind of forms of knowledge. But I really do think that we are doing now, and not only our office, but our office certainly is part of it, architecture in a way which I would say has transcended, has gone beyond modernism, and is fundamentally different than modernism was, and also is addressing a range of issues that are new, and so therefore, I really refuse to be drawn into a kind of situation where it looks as everything is bad, because with the new situations you can work, and of course it's also a stimulus to be new.
Which bring again to my to my fifth keywords, which is architecture. I would like to bring up a moment in your interview with O.M. Ungus before he passed away, in which he said, and I quote, "I think social problems cannot be resolved by architecture." To which you added, "Absolutely not. We have no means." And yet, one can never look at metabolism and its protagonist without ever looking their ambitions to change the world. We feel the evident political dimensions of their project. And not only the Metabolism project, I would say that in your projects and many other architects' projects, we witness the eagerness and the optimism that you just mentioned of wanting to change the world. Shall I say to the world, as architect, we long for using architecture not as a microphone, not as just a mouthpiece, but as toolbox that we want to at least to rock the world a little bit, if you will. So, rather than, but then we're facing this, you know, and that. So I wonder how you look at these things. We really want to change the world, and some of the things that we produced are very dubious.
Okay, so I'm going to be kind of a little bit unsophisticated or unsubtle. So basically, yes, we have all been infected with this gene. I certainly have been, and I'm not embarrassed about it, even though I know at times that it is absurd. And I think that if you go back one more, you see the kind of absurdity, and one more.
Of which one?
One more, the Kurokawa.
The Kurokawa.
No, back, one more. Oh, sorry, no, okay. If you go and look at, let's stay here. So Kurokawa did the capsule tower. The capsule tower is a kind of incredibly strong conceptual statement. It is dripping utopian ambitions, and less than 50 years after its existence, its inhabitants vote to destroy it. So that's a kind of incredible cycle. Luckily, I also know examples of different cycles. Something is very utopian. Initially, people are kind of really shocked by it, but over time, it becomes a deeply popular and essential part of a given society. So I think the utopian gene, I think we are lucky as architects to have it, because it gives our imagination a different dimension, and I'm sure it makes for happier people to have it than not to have it. So that's my answer there. Next. What was your next slide? At some point, I think that one of the exciting things in having a long career is that you have to constantly adjust and constantly challenge and question yourself to remain, I don't want to say relevant, but to keep a freshness, not so much in the eyes of others, but in your own eyes. And so this was, you know, and this is another kind of thing that I really it's kind of problematic. What nobody realizes, or I hope that somebody like you realizes, that basically almost more than half of the things we are doing are connected to humor, yeah? And to laughing and to jokes. And so, and that is also a very important drive. You know? And that is one of the things I think is a little bit tragic, that in the current perception, it's impossible that somebody like me has a kind of frivolity or a kind of willingness to make jokes. But this was simply a joke, or self-criticism represented in a kind of funny way, and simply asking the question, you know, what does everything we do add up to, and how do all these masterpieces look if you combine them in one picture? And so for us it was perhaps a moment where we were questioning our own extravagance in certain cases, and that enabled us to be more careful and more self-critical. So that's all it is.
Yeah, excellent. Which brings me to the next point, and I will probably stop there, or maybe just one more. I was there. I love the building, Rothschild. It's somehow people, I think, would compare these two they pretty much were finished at the same time. And yet, you have heard about the criticisms of being a iconic building, but sort of the shack value. And yet, Rothschild, when we were there, it feels as if it's a part of the city. It creates wonderful view towards the church, Ren's church. It's also the public passage. There seem to be two Oma or two Rem Koolhaas, or people at least are looking at it and thinking that there's two kinds of different projects. Does two different backgrounds brings two sets of different mentality, or is it actually the same kind of project that moves these projects of yours forward?
I would hope that there are even more. Yeah? It's not that simple. It's not kind of just two. It's as many Koolhaas as there are projects. And what we try to do is to, at every place, to do something which is really engaged with the place. And this is a kind of very complex and very dense part of the City of London. And it's on a site where you can never see the entire project. You only see fragments. So it would be crazy to do kind of something like this, like CCTV, which depends, of course, for its effect on its location in a kind of very visible place. So it's simply not related. And I would also like to say that CCTV, you can say it's kind of iconic, but in my eyes, it's, and now I maybe sound a little bit shameless, what I see in this picture is not a kind of solitary building that is kind of displaying its own genius in a kind of arrogant way. On the contrary, I see a kind of building that has the mysterious ability to connect itself with everything which is in the environment, whether it is low-key, whether it's a kind of ruin, whether it's kind of 1 story, 2 stories, or whether it is a kind of typically modern skyscraper. So I see, on the contrary, a kind of surprisingly delicate entity for such an enormous building. This building is 500,000 square meters, and I really challenge anyone to ever give me an example of a similarly big building that has such a kind of dynamic, careful, and even tender effect on the city and relationship with the city.
Okay. Very good. I think we should open our Q&A to the floor. I'm sure there's a lot of people who would like to have interaction with you. And I have more questions, and I can ask you later. Speak in Mandarin. Oh, 好，2楼那一位举手 ，up there.
Good evening. Hi, Mr. Koolhaas. I'd like to find out, after all that you've said about metabolism, how have this movement, the principles of metabolism, how has it directly or indirectly influenced your work? And perhaps you can also tell us, in particular, if it has influenced the Taipei Performing Arts Center that we're really looking forward to. Thank you.
I think that it's always very difficult to talk about the influence, because basically the influences that have had the most profound effect on me or on our work are probably unconscious influences, and influences that kind of simply come not necessarily in a kind of rational or intellectual process, but simply because we are influenced in an emotional way. So I would not really know a lot of direct influences of the metabolist on the work, except, of course, the ambition, except to read somebody like Kenzo Tange, with his name of a laboratory for his educational enterprise, kind of relating almost directly to some of our efforts in Harvard. So on that level, there are kind of course, direct influences. But I think in terms of formal or aesthetics, I don't really see them. But maybe that is because I'm blind to them, which is a kind of a real possibility. In terms of the Taipei theater, which we're working on now, and I'm incredibly happy that it's coming out of the ground. I think the emphasis in my head has been on how it will perform and how it will kind of offer theater makers new ways of making the theater. And I guess that indirectly in that sense, that is a comparable ambition with some of the metabolists, but I see it more maybe as an analogy of ambition than a formal analogy.
OK， 还有没有这个在场的来宾？那位同学，那位先生。
It seems that some of the work that you have shown us regarding metabolism.
Louder.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
No. Okay. Seems that some of the work that you have shown us regarding the metabolist, especially regarding to the land, the artificial ground, the floating cities above the sea and the sky, kind of make a distinct separation between the project and the city, and also through the language of the metabolist, that it's a very specific kind of an aggregation of components, of parts that's very, very distinct from what the historic architecture of Japanese architecture is. I'm just wondering if that is such distinction, such cut away from what was before, such radical departure from what was before, through both language and physical relationship, is that required to the formation of a new movement? And secondly, if you can talk about whether or not preservation through the role of adaptive reuse has any potential in the formation of such a new movement. Thank you.
Sorry, can you repeat the last question because I didn't understand it?
Sure.
What did you ask about preservation?
Whether or not preservation through the examples of adaptive reuse, whether or not these type of works that in some way directly engages with what has been built, whether or not this type of work has a role in terms of the creation of a new movement.
Well, I think that whether a movement essentially has to be based to be successful on a breakthrough tradition, I think that what I was trying to imply through showing Kensutanga's 50% tradition, 50% modernity, that at least in terms of rhetoric, and of course a movement is automatically deeply involved in rhetorical efforts, at least in terms of rhetoric, there has to be a way to not only insist on the break, but also to insist on continuity, because basically no culture is able to absorb a kind of radical break. So the continuities can be in informal terms. I think, as I also implied, and that's in the exhibition is sometimes even explicitly made clear that there is a connection between the Japanese roof and some other kind of megastructures. So that is another, maybe a trick, or maybe to find acceptance. But I think the real contradiction at the heart of metabolism is that the movement insisted on constant change and constant flux, and therefore constant instability, that there is a kind of moment that it kind of produces works that you nevertheless would like to preserve. And I think that even Kurokawa was not harsh enough with himself to say, okay, perfect, get rid of it. Actually, it should have disappeared 25 years ago when the first cracks appeared in the kind of capsules. And for me, this is kind of really something that kind of preoccupies me and the office more and more, and which I think is also, for instance, evidence of how each problematic aspect of a given period also has an inspiring effect. For us, preservation is becoming actually almost a new frontier for a kind of new thinking, about the relationship between what we have and what we will have. And I don't know whether you're aware of it, but we're trying to establish inside the office a kind of preservation department or preservation cell that is able to constantly devise new ways of thinking about it.
是那边吗？上面楼上是那边。麻烦站起来一下。
喂，谢谢。今天曾先生的提问呢，我觉得很精彩，但是Koolhaas可惜好像都回答得很巧妙。我想提的问题是。
等一下，谢谢。
可以吗 ？OK， 我想了解一下，就是Koolhaas，他的很多建筑案的业主都是国家，他是如何跟国家进行协商来决定他的建筑方案？第二个问题就是中央电视台。 是他最近很有名的一个案子，它的旁边就是中央商务区 CBD。那作为一个国家垄断的媒体，跟这个跨国企业所在的中央商务区，它要如何融合在一起？是一种共谋的关系，还是一种美化，还是一种孤立？那我也想请教，08年奥运的时候，汶川大地震。 许多学校都倒塌了，但是官方的建筑是屹立不摇。不知道他对中国的现状是不是有清醒的认识？谢谢。
Can you? I'm happy to answer. But what is the implication? What is the implication of the earthquakes thing? Can you be a bit more clear?
Rem, I think he was saying that most of the schools, for instance, and houses, they were all, torn, and yet all these state-invested public buildings still stands. I think his question was saying that somehow this power of the states invest itself through these buildings, and yet
leaves.
Yeah,
okay.
I think that was the question.
Yes, I of course, when we started on CC3, I was completely aware that it would be controversial. We were invited in the same week to be participating in the reconstruction of 9/11 on the kind of site that David showed. And we chose to kind of work for China. And the reason is that I think that the way the West has kind of looked at China and kind of responded to the rise of China has been very self-serving. I think that we have used a lot of arguments about how China ought to behave and how it is not behaving, that actually, in my view, are screens for political confrontation that has to do simply with a kind of diminishing power of the kind of Western world. So for me, it was important to show myself not necessarily on the side of the communist government, or not on the side of the government of China, although, of course, I'm aware that this is, or to some extent was, a government institution, but more to demonstrate my admiration for the incredible transformation that has happened in China, and for the huge effort that has been made in terms of making China a more bearable environment for its population, which I think is very clear overall. I think that also in detailed kind of fragments, I also believe that the kind of building itself is already beginning to have some effects on the kind of media situation in China. First of all, the monopoly that was there kind of maybe in the beginning is disappearing, kind of partly encouraged by the state. And also, I think the fact that currently they are kind of thinking of using the old CCTV building and the new building to create, on the one hand, central television, and on the other hand, China television, is the kind of beginning of an awareness, and I can speak from experience that there is a kind of real awareness that the building itself clearly makes it impossible to proceed with business as usual. And I think that, you know, without claiming a kind of super direct or super great effect of the building in the future of China, I think that fact alone, in a way, reinforces or gives me the conviction that it was right to participate.
Okay. I have students here who wanted me to ask a question for them. I prepared the slides. And if you don't mind, I'm asking the students, I'm asking Rem for my students of this next question, some of you up there. So I'm going to show you a few slides and ask something. It's your first book. You are a writer, a journalist. These are the books that you produce, well, some of them. As AA's exhibition described it, you have an OMA book machine. You also build buildings that house these the books. And these are the works, I think, that that was happening all over the world in the year, at the end of 2011, when you gave the talk at Barbican. And they're everywhere. So you're producing books, buildings, also at one time involved in the film projects, so on and so forth. I guess what I'm saying is this. You're almost everywhere. Geography, places, different culture seems to fascinate you. And these are the words you use to describe yourself, right? I think it was New York Public Library asked you to use 6 words. I would just use 1 word, this, amalgamations. You are a lot of things in one. And that was my students' questions. My student asked, how do you come to be you? How, you know, apparently, you mentioned this earlier in the press conference, you lived in Indonesia from the age 8 to 12. And that was you there at Indonesia, and that's why you look at this non-Western avant-garde movement. My student wanted to know how do you, Rem became Rem and can do all these things at the same time.
Well, I have to completely kind of reject the kind of notion that this is a kind of superhuman effort. Basically, I work with an office of 400 people. One of my partners is sitting on the first row. there's more kind of collaborators. It is kind of, if I'm good at anything, I'm good at collaboration. I showed you a lot of collaborators already in the lecture. I showed you kind of Irma Bohm, I showed you Hans-Ulrich Oberst, I showed you, it is all based, it's not the kind of work of a single individual, it's a kind of every single thing I do, we do. And in certain cases, I'm only a kind of minor participant. But I think what drives the entire effort is a kind of curiosity, as I kind of started to say. Not so much in kind of different places of the world as a kind of tourist that needs to be in Lagos and then Shanghai, etc., but and in that context, I think you should also perhaps kind of look at the participation in CCTV. I'm interested in understanding what is happening to the world in the period that I have the kind of privilege to be part of the world, and I'm interested in kind of participating in the most gripping, kind of relevant movements in that world. That's really all.
我们就到这里好吗？还是还有问题？好，谢谢各位。